Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Michael Alexander, Director of Public Programming at Caltech in Pasadena, California. Caltech is one of the world's most highly regarded research and education institutions and has been making incredible contributions to our comprehensive understanding of the sciences and their place in the world we live in. Caltech manages JPL, which is overseeing the research being conducted on Mars by Perseverance and Ingenuity. Caltech also has a long history of presenting public lectures on the sciences and is well known for its nearly 60-year history of presenting the finest in touring performing arts. For more information about our programs, you can go to events.caltech.edu. We are thrilled to be partnering with Zócalo Public Square, and it is my pleasure to introduce its Executive Director, Moira Shourie.
Thank you, Michael. I'm Moira Shourie from Zócalo Public Square. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to one another. Everything we do is free and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing and convene events just like this one. Please find out more on our website, zocalopublicsquare.org, and listen to us on all the major podcast platforms. If you like today's conversation, please like us, follow us, and subscribe. We are honored to partner with Caltech Live Behind the Book to present today's conversation with Nobel Prize winner Sir Paul Nurse, who joins us from his home in London. Moderating the discussion is Dr. Magdalena Zernicka-Goetz, a trailblazing scientist who has unveiled new knowledge about human embryonic cells. She is the Bren Professor of Biology and Biological Engineering at Caltech, and she splits her time between Pasadena and the University of Cambridge. In her recent book, The Dance of Life, she revealed the wonder of the earliest and most profound moments in how we become human. Over to you, Magda.
Thank you, Moira. This is really so exciting to be here to speak with one of the most notable figures in the field of genetics, Paul Nurse, and yet he struggled to get into university, an experience that taught him to be resilient, determined, and not afraid of failure. A clearly successful strategy as Paul became a Nobel Prize winner, knighted for his services to study cancer, former head of the most important cancer charity in the UK, then head of the prestigious Rockefeller University in New York, to finally return to Britain as a president of the Royal Society and now director of one of the most wonderful places to do science, the Crick Institute in London. Finally, also the author of the book, What is Life, that I have here. This is one of most fascinating questions to address, what really life is, and Paul presented it in 5 great ideas of biology, highly recommended. So Paul climbed a long ladder to be where he is today, and his scientific path wasn't conventional, and that's what I love about it most. And actually the same can be said about his personal life. And here Paul and I have some common ground. Due to the revelation in our 50s, we each had to rethink our past history and where we are coming from, as this was kept secret for us, to us, from us, until we were in our 50s. And I hope we would be able to come back to it later. So Paul's love to the natural world was inspiration when, as a boy, he was making his very long walk to school in London. And later, as a research scientist, his decision to study East caused some of the amusement among his colleagues. And yet he was right. It was the foundation of the most important discovery that he has made so far. What determines when and how cells divide, principle to East and humans, bringing insight into the molecular nature of cancer. He discovered all those things because, he says, he really wanted to know, and because of the beauty of biology. So Paul, I'm really thrilled to be able to speak with you today, and I would like to begin with the perhaps most simple question: who was the boy who became a man who won the Nobel Prize? You are not from a bookish background, and so where did the fascination to science come from? Your book starts with this incredible image of flying free butterfly, which really intrigued you and show you a beauty of science. So is this the biology? Well, is this the beauty of biology itself? that's inspired you? Or is it the beauty of the discovering, something that nobody ever seen before, or maybe even never thought that this exists?
Well, Magda, firstly,
Paul.
Magda, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and it's a pleasure to be speaking to everybody there. So good afternoon. It's evening here in London. Beautiful blue skies, I have to say. Beauty of biology, beauty of discovery. You know, Magda, you say it well, and it was both. I mean, biology is beautiful. The diversity of life is magnificent. How even the simplest insect, let alone a simple yeast cell, which you rightly indicated is what I spent my entire life studying. There's beauty in all of that. But there is also a beauty in discovering something new, something that maybe is never been thought of before. Sometimes, you know, there's a real excitement being on the edge of that. Maybe I am the only person who have thought this. Usually that isn't correct. Sometimes you think it is.
We can believe it is.
But usually it's not. But I think the starting point was indeed when, as you mentioned, was my interest in natural history when I was 10, 11, 12, 13, that sort of age. And the butterfly was a metaphor. I watched the yellow brimstone butterfly, and it's on the book, the back of the book that you showed. I watched butterflies flitting around the garden, and I really did wonder, what is it that makes a butterfly different from a stone? Or for that matter, what is it that makes a butterfly similar to me? And these were big questions, and I certainly didn't answer them at 12, 13. I'm not sure I've answered them now, 60 years later, but at least I've had a go with that book as to communicate what I think we should be thinking about in trying to answer that very important question, maybe the most important question in biology.
Well, I think I agree with you. So I actually believe you are addressing this question very, very well. So I have to say that in the middle of the book, when I was thinking, gosh, you know, I thought I know all of it, but then having it all together shown to me that my 14-year-old and me were both able to enjoy it, which is just incredible. So I highly recommend also for 14-year-olds and more.
Well, I wrote it. And always in the back of my mind whilst writing was a 14-year-old boy or girl. That was always in my head.
Here you are. So not 13-year-old, 1 year more. You have to wait. So Paul, there is something else that we share. I think it's admiration of art. And I think that you often said, and I often say this too, that science is very creative. And, you know, in a sense, isn't it like painting? Is that the painter needs skills to apply the paint across the canvas, or sculpture needs to have a clay to be able to portray something like this feature that I have behind me. But this is so much more than just the skills to be able to deliver a good painting. There is some kind of image that we have to portray. We have to interpret our observations. So can you explain where the creativity in science come from?
Well, firstly, I want to say that artists and scientists share, and you already hinted at this, not only creativity, but what you could say being an artisan. Scientists have to do things with their hands. They're not just working in the head. They have to get things to work with their hands. Of course, an artist does too. But it's not good enough either if you're an artist or a scientist just to be a skilled craftsman or craftswoman. You have to also have something creative to say, to paint, to demonstrate. And what I like particularly to think about is what is common in the creative act for somebody who is an artist, or for that matter, working in the humanities, and or writing a novel or whatever, and a scientist, because there is a similarity there, the creative act. And I think it has something to do with a number of things. One thing that's important, and was argued by Arthur Koestler, I should say, many years ago, is putting things together, juxtaposing certain ideas or concepts or images that don't normally go together. And when they are put next to each other, again, metaphorically, they produce something else that's different, that's new. And it's the juxtapositioning that is interesting. Koestler, who I read this idea from, made a comparison with comedians. Comedians are often funny because they put words together or circumstances together which are unusual and lead to something comical or humorous. And that's another aspect of creativity. And there is something more about the creativity, which is to think differently from how people have thought before you. And this addresses another problem, particularly in science, and I imagine for artists too, that often when you have an idea about how something works, you get stuck on a railway track. It's the only way you can think it will work. And you're just rattling down the railway line and thinking, this is the idea, this is the hypothesis. And it's often very difficult to jump off that railway track into another railway track going in a different direction. And so creativity's got to also embrace the, I wouldn't quite call it randomness, but the ability to change your mind and to think of things in a different way. And great artists demonstrate that. If you take Picasso, for example, and look at the wide range, not only of the ways of expressing himself, but also what he was expressing, is indicative of somebody who was constantly changing tracks. And I find that often scientists get stuck on the same track. So with my students, and I still have quite a number of graduate students, I always argue, attack your own ideas, because if you don't, somebody else will. And if they get shaky, look to jump tracks and think of other ways that you might think about a problem. And even if they don't look shaky, think about that too, because you never know. It may be there's 1, 2, 3, or 4 explanations that can explain the phenomena that you're interested in. So creativity is key. It has a number of aspects. And I think we have something to learn from each other in these different lifestyles, different disciplines that artists and scientists have.
Well, I can't agree with you more. And I think that often this creativity comes when maybe when we wake up and the relaxation of our scrutiny and criticism towards our own thoughts is relaxed. So, you wake up with the idea, you think this, you dream about it, but most likely this was this coming out from the deep sleep when your brain is awake, but yet not too critical. You might find out, this eureka moment and something new is coming into the picture that you have never considered before. Or, and I hear this relates to the question to you, I know that in the Crick Institute, you started something very new or unusual, or I don't know this in any other institutes that I ever worked or visited. You introduce artists to the Institute. So you introduce, you essentially open the doors to artists, musicians, and to the public. So do you think this is one way of getting people that might think intensively about specific problem they want to address in a different way, so to get them out of the track? Some of them complain and say this is annoying them because they can't focus on their work, but I actually think it's fantastic because this defocus might be what really brings something very new. But what is your take on it?
It sounds as if that probably is not quite what I was thinking when I did it, but I think you're completely right. I think that this notion of jumping the track requires you, exactly as you say, to take your mind from the place where it is into somewhere else, so you can look back in a different way. And I often say to colleagues, go on holiday, go for a walk, switch off your brain, and when it switches on again, it switches on in a different place. I'm a glider pilot, and when I'm flying, I don't think of anything else but flying. And then when you come back to my normal intellectual life, it's different. Now, you didn't ask me that, but you were commenting on it, so I thought I would make a comment there. Yes, I think it's, what I felt about coming into the building was slightly different, but I think it actually satisfies what you said. I wanted my colleagues, when coming into the building, to look around and to be full of awe and of wonder, because what they were going to do was an activity that was full of awe and wonder, and the building should reflect that. So we have a rather grand front that you may remember when you came in from Cambridge on the train. It's got quite a magnificent atrium where your mind soars up like a Gothic cathedral. You know, they always said they built a Gothic cathedral so your mind would soar to the roof. And outside, I applied actually to the Wellcome Trust for money to put up a piece of public art. And there's a sculpture put up by Conrad Shawcross, who won the competition. It's called Paradigm. And it's a set of triangles that are built on top of each other, made of rusty iron, because it used to be an industrial site. It starts very thin, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it represents an idea growing. As you put extra sort of segments on, it gets more and more impressive. But because it starts from such a small beginning, it has a look of total instability. And the notion was, ideas are unstable, and maybe when you put one more thing on top, it all collapses. And it's called Paradigm because it's making a paradigm, but that paradigm may collapse. And every time somebody comes to the Institute, they're supposed to look at it. I'm sure they don't. They're probably thinking, when can I get my first cup of coffee or something like that? But it is to demonstrate how we think. But you're right, we also put in a public gallery in the front part of the Institute, which is open to the public. We have exhibitions there. Some of them are art exhibitions related often to science. Sometimes, most recently, we had an exhibition celebrating what technicians do in science. Wow. Which is also a little unusual.
Excellent idea. Yes.
Well, it is because
technicians are forgotten.
They're ignored and forgotten, and as we know, crucial. So
they are crucial. So, then, Paul, maybe this. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. One more thing, and then next to that is a school laboratory for 7 to 11-year-olds, primary school children who never see a laboratory. Secondary school children do. And we have over 2,000 7 to 11-year-olds coming through that laboratory every year. It's a really big activity, reaching out to local school kids in North London. But I interrupted you.
No, not at all. I have to say that we should try to introduce also maybe projects for the 7 to 12-year-olds, right? That they can build their paradigm and see how it goes. So I have another question that really was inspired by your book, and I think that it would be worth of sharing your insight on this. So in your book, you say that best research is both intensely individual and utterly communal. So what do you mean?
Well, it's really to recognize that we carry out a research activity as an individual. And that's perhaps driving us, to try and succeed and contribute something ourselves. But we're also utterly reliant on our colleagues and more widely, the scientific community around us. So we are not an individual island. Although we drive our own personal research, often in a very individual way. But though we do that, we have to recognize that we are part of a community. And having worked in different places in the world, I've found that there is a real balance that you have to get, which respects the individual and what they contribute, and also acknowledges the community and how much they support that individual. And sometimes some cultures emphasize perhaps too much the individual, and others can emphasize too much the entire communal activity. And we have to strike, at least from my perspective, the balance in between those two pressures, because they are both exceedingly important. When I was in the US at the Rockefeller University, when I was president, I probably learned more to recognize and acknowledge the individual, because that is tends to be more US culture. When in the UK, there was perhaps more of an emphasis on community, but putting both of those together, I think, is the most powerful way to proceed.
What guided your own creativity? So I wish to go back to Paul, who was this little boy and then growing boy, and who fell in love with East and decided to devote part of his life. Essentially, I think as a scientist, you started your scientific journey with that specific model system. So now we understand that this just generated impressive and outstandingly important insight to what regulates the cancer, what regulates how cells divide. So I wonder first, what really started this journey for you, where this thought, idea came from? Can you go back to this person you were when you were maybe 20-year-old and decided to embark on that risky and some people thought ridiculous path, and yet you persisted? So this was the very strong streak of individuality and determinism that was shaping you at that time. And when did you realize that actually you were right? This is going to have a profound effect.
Well, I think my starting point is was doing my PhD. As you're quite right, around 22, that sort of age, and realizing how difficult research was. It is actually tough. And that made me think, if I'm going to do this, I've got to have a go at something that I think is important, because I probably will fail, and I've got to get satisfaction from at least trying to do something I think is important. So that meant how could I identify something that was important? Now, what I found is most people around me would be reading the popular journals, Nature, Science at the time. Cell was still yet to be fully operational, and were tending to follow what was already topical, already being pursued. And I thought, well, that's probably not the wisest way to do it. So I thought I would try and strip back my thinking to first principles, not unlike these great ideas that this book has ended up saying. And I began to think, what is it that distinguishes a living thing? So it's the same question as what is life. And one of the characteristics is the ability to reproduce yourself. And all organisms reproduce themselves. And then I thought, well, what is the fundamental process behind that? And I realized that, of course, it's the reproduction of cells. I mean, that is the basic and most core fundamental example of reproduction, the division of one cell to two. And understanding how that came about and how temporal order of the different events that had to take place that led from the birth of a cell to its division was probably the simplest developmental sequence that occurred in living systems, and was at the same time a developmental sequence that all living things had to go through. And so maybe there was something there that was going to be common to large areas of life. I mean, we would now say prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and so on. I wasn't sure how large they would be, but there were likely to be commonalities there. So all of this was going on in my head as I was failing in my PhD experiments, as to think about something I could do. So I thought, understanding that, and understanding maybe in the first instance how it was all controlled, because obviously it would be very complicated to know all the components and so on of the mechanism, but to understand how that was regulated, the temporal order, what coordinated growth with cell reproduction, was a very important problem that frankly wasn't really being looked at by anybody. I mean, at the time, or hardly. And the more I read about it, the more I realized that that it was an important problem, and that the way to address it was through genetics. And I read Lee Hartwell, Lee Hartwell got the Nobel Prize in 2001, when Tim Hunt and myself did as well. And Lee had used budding yeast to start dissecting the yeast cell cycle, the budding yeast cell cycle, pulling on his previous work, which was on development of viruses. So he also had in his head developmental sequences, starting with the virus, and then turning it to a bigger problem. So there was a sort of overlap in our thinking. But my problem was I wasn't a geneticist at that time, and I wasn't working on yeast at that time. But I decided I would learn both of those things. And in fact, after I finished my PhD, which was on botany and a fungus and amino acid metabolism, which is what I could get my PhD thesis down from up there, that I would try and do this problem. And I went to Switzerland to work with somebody called Urs Leopold, who taught me genetics. I spent 6-9 months in his lab. He just taught me it, not for his own benefit, but just because he wanted to teach a young person interested in it, in Bern in Switzerland. And then I went to Murdoch Mitchison, another person who was a great supporter of me in Edinburgh. And he was interested in how cells grew. And I combined the genetics to his understanding of, in this case, fission yeast and how it grew to develop this project. And I want to say one more thing about these two gentlemen who are both deceased. I worked in total about 7 years in Switzerland and in Edinburgh in Scotland. I published about 15 papers. They didn't put their name on any paper I produced. And I was only 23 or 24 when I started this, because they didn't think they'd contributed enough. They were just very happy to support a young kid like me doing what I wanted to do. It was a huge statement of generosity that I always like to acknowledge.
It's very good that you bring it. And I have to admit that, when I was growing up as a scientist in Poland, in the lab of Andrzej Tarkowski, he had the same gesture towards me. When I started to embark on something that he felt was my idea and was unique and different, he said, well, you can publish. He actually encouraged me to publish it under my name. So I have a few publications just with my name, very unusual, very unusual. To a certain extent, when I moved to Cambridge and I realized how unusual it is, I was nearly embarrassed about it. I thought, oh, maybe nobody supported me. Nobody wanted to put their name towards me to help me. So, that's incredible how it was in the past and how it changed. But Paul, coming back to how cell divides. So we know so much. We discovered this master regulatory genes and more. We understand cell cycle, nature of it. And we know that cancer means that the cell cycle control goes wrong. So please tell us, why is this that we still not are able to cure cancer, to prevent it from happening or stop it when it happens? Why it is that we cannot prevent specific group of cells that goes wrong from dividing? Why do we have to act globally? And therefore, of course, it doesn't work because it protects life. Well, it enables life. So give us your insight. And can we ever cure cancer? And when would it be?
Well, I'll give you my opinion on this. What I've worked on all my life is what you could say is the core regulation of cell reproduction, the developmental sequence as cells go through their cell cycle, and what controls the onset of those events, how they are coordinated. Those processes are common to all cells, both normal cells, both actually from yeast to human beings. It's highly conserved, which is something we may talk about a little later, but also for cancer cells. And I thought for a long time, and I was actually not correct on it, that it would be mostly irrelevant for cancer, because actually these core genes were common. They were needed for all cell types, whether cancerous or not. But what was around them was a periphery of regulatory controls that operate in our own bodies, which respond to all sorts of signals to do with your differentiation, what organ you're in, whether your tissue is damaged and the like. And there's probably 200, 300, 400 genes in some network surrounding the core. And it is in fact defects and alterations in this periphery that where we look for the problems of cancer, because these are growth regulatory in some respects. They all come through the cyclin-dependent kinases and other core functions, but they don't give you specificity, those core functions. The specificity comes from the defects from the periphery. And so that's the reason why I think the core is less important, except the core is also regulating progression through the cycle, which ensures genomic stability. And of course, when genomic stability breaks down, then you generate the DNA damage that can also cause cancer. So in fact, I was not entirely correct, because the core genes do have some effects, and they therefore result as potential targets. Now, that complexity means that we are probably looking at a number of hundreds, several hundreds of genes that are important for cancer. And I think that's how it's come out. And this in turn means that different cancers are caused by defects in different combinations of those 300 or 400 genes, which explains fundamentally why we have so many different types of cancer. Traditionally, we think of breast cancer or cancer of the liver, where the organ is that it arose. But there's all sorts of reasons why you can get cancers in different places. And if we are to treat a particular cancer, then we have to understand which of those peripheral genes are altered and what impact they have on the regulatory system and how you might interfere with it. This in turn will mean, given there's hundreds of genes involved, that there will be potentially hundreds of different treatments that you have to think about if you want to be specific in the way that you treat cancer. So I would say, given that complexity, we will never have a cure for cancer. I mean, people could argue about that, but we could have many cures for cancer, which will be built gradually over the years. So it's a little different from the magic bullet of penicillin, say, where you kill bacteria with a single medical and scientific advance. I think what we will see in cancer is gradual improvement in understanding of what is a hugely complicated disease, definition of the different cancers, and then over time, specific treatments and cures for those cancers, knowing where in the network it's gone wrong. So when will we cure cancer? I'm not sure we will ever cure cancer, but I'm sure we will move ourselves gradually over time into a much better place so that many cancers can be cured or controlled, but probably will never escape the curse of cancer completely.
Well, thank you so much for giving this honest answer. I know we would love to hear the answer, yes, 5 years from now, but that's really complex answer, but you explain it very beautifully. So I wish to come to personal genetics right now. And I know you were answering this question many times over the last few years, but I think that it is so fascinating that I would like to bring it back. So to explain to those people who do not know yet about this, that rather late in your life, you discover that your family roots are not exactly as you thought they were. Can you really please tell us a little bit? And before you do, I wish to say that only just a few months ago, this year, 3 months ago, I discovered also family secret kept in my life through the generations. And this is because my daughter decided to do genetic testing. And we found that actually the origins of my own family are very different that I was always said they were. I was always said that I'm partially Italian, and it turned out that I'm partially Jewish. And I understand why it was kept secret. The family decided, well, they started to stay in Poland during the war, and they also stayed in Poland after the war. And anti-Semitism was so strong that with this decision of staying in the country, this was really well kept secret from my father and from me. I think it only now makes sense to me what my father was telling to me before he died. And only now I am sort of discovering the conversations that I had with them that makes a totally new sense to me. So it's really fascinating to rediscovering our roots. In your case, the story was much bigger, and I wish you to tell this to us, what it was. And specific question that I would like to ask you is, yesterday was Mother's Day here in US, and I was wondering, what would you tell to your real mother if she were alive yesterday?
Well, I would probably ask her who was my father, is probably the question I would ask her.
I would ask the same question. I was thinking what would be my answer.
I can explain this and the story behind it if you give me enough time to do that. I came from a working class family in North London. I had 2 brothers and a sister. We lived in a small flat with my parents and my grandmother. I was the only one who stayed on at school after the age of 15. I went to university, I became an academic, and I became a geneticist. And I always wondered why I had accomplished more academically than the rest of my family and my siblings. And that intrigued me, but I never came to a solution. Came to America, president of Rockefeller University, got tired of queuing all the time in immigration, applied for a green card, and I was turned down by Homeland Security. Now, I was a bit surprised at the time because I was turned down. I was rather proud of them for doing it, actually. At the time, I was a Nobel Laureate. I was president of a university and
prestigious university.
Yeah, and one of a very prestigious university, as you say, and yet they turned me down. And they turned me down because they didn't like my birth certificate. And my birth certificate was what was called a short birth certificate in the UK, and it named where I was born and my birth date and so on, and my nationality, but not my parents. And the Homeland Security said, we want to know more about you, so get a long birth certificate, which will tell you, give more information. So I wrote away and back to London, got a long birth certificate. And I remember this, I'd just been on holiday in Australia, and I'd just come back with my wife, and I was in the big office in Rockefeller. You'll see here, I'm now in a small office in London, but that was a huge office. And I was there, and I had my PA and my PA's assistant and my lab manager and my wife, and we were just going through the mail. And then I heard my PA talking to Anne in a bit of a whisper and saying, we had this letter back with Paul's birth certificate in it, and is it possible that he got the name of his mother wrong? And I heard this and I said, don't be ridiculous. Of course I know the name of my mother. But everybody's ears pricked up and sort of looked at me, and I opened the envelope, and there is indeed my birth certificate. And I looked down, and indeed the name there for my mother was my sister. It was my sister, not my mother. I couldn't quite work out this. So I looked to see who my father was, and there was just a line, a dash. And my wife, Anne, who's a bit quicker on the uptake than I am on this sort of thing, said, you do know what this might mean, don't you? And I said, well, I don't really know. I'm not really quite sure what's going on here. And she cast her eyes to heaven, of course. And then we thought about it. And to cut a long story short, it turned out that my mother at 17 got pregnant, was sent from London, from Wembley, where the stadium is, which is where we lived, to Norwich, where her aunt lived, where my mother's aunt lived, gave birth to me, and my grandmother came up and pretended she was the mother and brought me back to protect her daughter. Because this was 1949, it was still a great dishonor to have a pregnancy at 17, 18, and to be unmarried. And then they pretended, my grandparents, to be my parents, and never told me. This would be impossible today. Of course, it wouldn't happen today. And I was never officially adopted even. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. I entered the system, but I was never officially adopted. And I only found out with this birth certificate, and there was one person, my mother, real mother, birth mother, had died. My grandparents, who were my parents, had died. What's interesting about this is everybody changes their position in your family. So my brothers became my uncles, my sister became my mother, my parents became my grandparents, my grandmother became my great-grandmother, and so it went on and on and on. So I've started calling everybody by their double assignation, so I can keep it straight in my head. But in the house I was born in Norwich was an 11-year-old girl who takes interest in babies. Because my brothers said, oh, when I asked them, well, Mum went away to Norwich and came back with you. They didn't think anything more about it. But the girl said, yes, this is all true, and we were all sworn to secrecy, and nobody told me at all. And here's me, who's not a bad geneticist, and this was kept secret for over half a century by my less than sophisticated family. So that's my story.
Yeah. That's incredible. I think it's really incredible how we can reevaluate everything what have happened during our childhood. But I imagine Paul would have become Paul as Paul is right now for us, even if he was brought up by his real mom. So that's how I think about it. I wish to say something, Paul, because we don't have so much time, and soon I will have to start taking questions, not from my own list of questions, which is much longer than what we were able to cover today. But I would like to mention just maybe two things at the end. So one is that I know that at one point of your life, when the lab is going very well, and I'm sure that like many scientists, when they're very young and start their research, they love to do experiments. They're able to discover things by using their not just imagination. We often use our hands in the lab, and this combination of hands, imagination, obsession, passion, all of this somehow is just bubble in which scientists often live, and of course communication with our colleagues is a very important aspect of it. But in mid-90s, you switched your role in scientific life from being a person at the bench to become the director of one of the biggest UK research charities. And then, of course, lots of other big jobs were followed from that. So this is really unusual step for a young scientist to make that step. So I wonder what it is that made you choose that path at that moment of your life. And I'm thinking about it in the context of what you have learned about yourself when you changed that path at that moment. And I'm thinking also about it, what would be the lesson for scientists, young scientists who are often having this dilemma to decide what they're going to be in the future, staying in the lab or go and do more what you are doing right now. Tell us about it.
Well, I can. I mean, I was an experimental scientist for about 20 years, if you include my PhD. And I had very little responsibility beyond that, in fact. And so I didn't have teaching responsibilities. I didn't have a permanent job. I was always on short-term contracts, but it meant I could keep working in the laboratory. I was then actually, for a couple of years, I was head of a small department in Oxford. So I was made a professor. I didn't like it, actually. I found university, especially ancient universities, rather time-consuming and wasted quite a lot of my time.
Let's explain that ancient means Oxford, Cambridge.
Yes, ancient means Oxford and Cambridge. And then I was asked if I would go and run the Imperial Cancer Research Fund in London, which was a precursor for Cancer Research UK, which I set up some years later. Now, I can tell you exactly what I thought at the time. And the deal I did when I went back to run ICRF, I said, I will do this. And I'll tell you why I felt I should do it. And it was this. I was doing research just following my curiosity. I wasn't at all sure that I was doing anything that would be useful or utilitarian. I mean, I was working with yeast. I hadn't yet solved the problem of quite how it worked.
But you know, you were working on most important problem, right?
Yes, I knew, but the world didn't necessarily see it quite that way. I thought I was, and I was very confident about it. And I had this sort of deal in my head. I thought, well, I'm quite good at managing things. I'd already realized that. And I thought this, if I'm good at managing stuff and could run something for half my life, the other half I can just pursue whatever I find interesting. So when I went back to ICRF in central London, I said, yes, I'll run it, but the other half of my life I want with my lab. And I set it up so that I really did spend half my life, really, not approximately, not half a day, not one day, half of my week was in my laboratory, and the other half I ran something. And what made me feel comfortable about it is just that I was paying, if you like, for the privilege to follow my curiosity wherever it led me by doing work, by running something, which I was quite good at.
Yeah,
and that's honestly how it's remained. I still spend half of my life in this big damn institute here, in my lab, which is just next door, which is why I'm in this small office here and I don't have a big one. I pay for my privilege of having curiosity by running things. And that's really the truth. I don't actually even enjoy running things. I know I'm a fairly happy sort of person, but I'm not. In fact, it doesn't turn me on as it does many people.
Okay.
It's the lab next door that turns me on.
So here I have the very final question to you. Despite that I have a long list, I'm going to go and take the questions from audience now, but the final. You say you don't like it, and I sort of understand, but I know you have to make often extremely difficult decisions, like who to appoint and who not. You chair the committee of the Wellcome Trust, and you chair the committee when I was in front of that committee. Fortunately, I passed, fortunately. So how do you recognize the best scientists, the most creative scientists that apply to the Crick Institute, or who you have a pleasure to meet in different type of organization when you are chairing committees and they have to either get their funding for the next 5 years or not? How do you make this decision in 15 minutes? Often this is how much we are given when we are coming to be in front of you.
Smell. There's something about people that you can detect it, you can taste it, you can know when you have somebody who is creative, who's somebody who has energy, who's somebody who's bold. They may or may not be extrovert, introvert, or whatever. They may not be articulate. It's easy to get distracted by people who are articulate. But there is a key feature. They have to have a passion, a real passion of wanting to know the answer. And if you can pick that up in 15 minutes and they look capable and they look as if they've done something, give them a chance. Simple as that.
Excellent lesson. Really excellent answer. I'm going to now go to all of the questions that we were sent in the meantime. And here you are. What creative art do you think is the most complementary to science and invention? I'm not pre-selecting arty questions, but I'm going to go with this one as it comes first.
For some reason, I think it is painting and sculpture linked to painting. And it is because of what I said before. It is a combination of extraordinary skill, of artisanship, with a creative approach to the subject and how you are presenting that subject and the ideas that come from it. So it is the connection of the head with craftsmanship. And I think you see that particularly with painting. So I think it would be painting.
I like your answer and agree. What have you discovered lately that has helped you stay optimistic?
I'm basically a very optimistic person, to the great annoyance of my family, who just think I'm ridiculously cheerful all the time. we've just had an election result in my country that I'm not very keen on, and yet I still remain cheerful, for example. And I think I'm optimistic in the fundamental decency of the majority of people. Of course, I understand evil. Of course, I understand it's not everybody, but fundamentally, people are decent and often only behave in bad ways when there's very particular circumstances that do that. So I think it has something, my optimism has something to do with the decency of people and with the civilization that has come from that. You talked about art, but civilization more generally, literature and the like, makes me feel just optimistic. I've got to open an exhibition in Oxford, actually, next week, celebrating the 400th year of the Botanical Gardens. And it's being held in the Bodleian Library, which is the main library of Oxford University. And I was thinking about it last night, and I thought, you know, libraries and gardens are the peak of human civilization. You cannot help but feel optimistic when you're sitting in a library surrounded by the fruits of civilization, or sitting in a garden surrounded by the fruits of nature. And that's not a proper answer, but that's what makes me optimistic.
That's a beautiful answer, and I think it's a real answer. Okay, we have one more. Well, we have so few questions, but one more that that relates to the toughest life experience. So what has been your toughest life experience that led you to become a geneticist?
That led me to become a geneticist.
And how has it helped you to be a better human being? So it assumed that it helped you to become a better human being. So how would you see this connection between becoming geneticist and better human being?
Well, I think the toughest professional decision was the one you've already brought up, when I moved back from Oxford to run an institute in London, because this meant that I would have to reframe my thinking, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I mean, at that time, so that I would have to run things. The tough decision to make become a geneticist earlier, of course, and I think I answered that because genetics is a beautiful subject. It is in some respects, and I would say that, wouldn't I, one of the more intellectual sides of biology, genetics, and the use of genetics. And I was attracted by the beauty of the thinking and the reasoning. You know, you look at the famous experiments of Crick and Brenner to establish the triplet code, and you're just full of wonder at the beauty of the thinking. And that isn't exactly a tough decision, but I felt I wanted to be part of that, if only a small part. I wanted to be part of that tradition. And not only is it beautiful, but it's immensely powerful, genetics, in revealing how things work, about phenomena that you really have no idea what the molecular basis might be. It's the doorway into molecular mechanism through studying the whole organism and the changes that have there. We saw that with Drosophila development, for example, and homeotic mutants. And we see that with yeast in a variety of different arenas. So I've wandered a bit off the most difficult decision, but that certainly was influenced my attraction to genetics.
I accept it. And I have one more question. In your opinion, what exactly is the meaning of life? And I had actually the same question on my list of questions. I'm reading this one because I didn't manage to go there. What's the meaning of life? Well, in a personal way, as well as scientific.
Well, I should say my book is about what is life, and not about the meaning of life.
Absolutely.
So I ought to emphasize that the meaning of life, which sounds like a Monty Python sort of film or book, and I find many Americans like Monty Python, so I hope that's understandable. I don't know what the meaning of life is. I think the local meaning is looking after your family, developing your family, looking after your colleagues, looking after your friends. There's a meaning there. And it's part of the meaning of being human, of humanity, of empathy with others. On a bigger and broader scale, the meaning of life whilst you're on the planet is to try and improve the lot of humankind. And that may be through some intellectual discovery. It may be entirely local, as I was saying, your local family. It may be by producing some wonderful piece of art. It may be by political leadership in some sense, but it has to be aimed at improving the lot of humanity, whether small or big, and in whatever arena you can be most effective.
I think that I will have to, it's a beautiful way of closing it, and it's really a pity that we have to close it, but I'm afraid we have to because the time comes to the end. And thank you so much, Paul, for speaking with me and with all of the audience. I would like to also thank Zócalo Public Square and Caltech for presenting this conversation. There will be written summary of our conversation on Zócalo website by tomorrow, along with the interviews with both of us. So thank you very much, audience, for listening to us, and I hope you continue to explore those ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. Very enjoyable. Thank you.
Very enjoyable. Thank you.